In some ways, I suppose I'm probably an unusual choice to be testifying before you on this. I've never bought a pack of cigarettes. For that matter, I've never smoked one. But that is actually the challenge, because 50 years ago, that would have been highly atypical. In 1965, not only had the vast majority of adult Americans at least tried a cigarette, but 42% were regular smokers nationwide. Today, that number stands at 19% and falling, according to CDC. Department of Health and Human Services is targeting a 12% rate by 2020. Now, in West Virginia, the number is significantly higher than that. It's estimated at 27.3%, the highest adult smoking rate in the country compared to that national average of 19%. But certainly, this is a declining, the declining purchases, the declining share, and of course, declining taxes going along with that. That rate is certainly falling. So any discussion of tobacco taxes must proceed from the fact that tobacco use is declining. That decline is likely to continue, and it will have significant revenue ramifications for the state. West Virginia's tobacco products tax is projected to raise $100.4 million in fiscal year 2016, accounting for 2.33% of anticipated general fund revenue. Now, by way of comparison, in fiscal 2010, the tobacco products tax accounted for 2.86% of revenue, and in fiscal 2005, the cigarette and the smokeless tobacco tax, they had not been combined at that point, combined for about 3.28% of general fund revenue. So again, 10 years from 3.28% to 2.33% of general fund revenue. There can be little doubt as to the overall trend that all states, but certainly West Virginia, is experiencing. West Virginia's 55 cents a pack excise tax dates to 2003. Before that, it was 17 cents a pack. The rate increased 324%. Collections that first year increased 270%. In other words, West Virginia did not receive a one-to-one revenue increase on the tax hike, though it did capture most of that revenue in the first year. And I've seen the projections that have been put together for possible increases, whether it was to 75 cents a pack, $1 pack, $1.25, and most of them assume essentially first year about 90% margin, that if you would assume that there was no change in consumption, you'd have 100%. So they're assuming that there's about a 10% fall off on that margin. The experience of 2003 might suggest it's slightly more than that, but that's ballpark. The challenge, of course, is that unusually in a tax like this, your first year is likely to be your high watermark, or at least close to it. What was collected in 2004, the year after the increase in the cigarette tax, was $100.8 million. You're anticipated to collect $100.4 million this year. You're in the same place as you were over a decade ago. And that will be the challenge. Even if you were to raise taxes, certainly there is a short-term revenue increase associated with that. But given the decline in the use of tobacco products, you will likely see that as close to the higher watermark as it again continues to erode. Like I said, in fiscal 2016, the state's projected to raise just a hair below what it raised the first full fiscal year after the new rates were in effect, and that's in nominal terms. Obviously, in real terms, revenue declined further. Over that time, tobacco taxes have slid substantially in terms of their revenue share for the state. Now, policymakers impose excise taxes on tobacco for a variety of reasons, and some of them are potentially in at least some tension with each other. Some policymakers seek to induce behavioral effects, using taxes as a means to increase the costs and therefore decrease the incidence of smoking. Others see cigarette taxes as a means of paying for the state's share of the health costs of tobacco use, and still others regard it just as a more general source of revenue. The problem, of course, is that to the extent that cigarette taxes reduce consumption, state revenue falls. Even absent these effects, tobacco consumption is clearly declining in secular terms, and if you're seeking long-term revenue stability, raising taxes on a shrinking base probably isn't the best way to carry that out. Estimates of price elasticity vary greatly for tobacco products. A number of academic studies have pegged elasticity between negative 0.2 and negative 0.6, which means that for each percentage increase in the price of cigarettes, there will be a reduction in consumption between 2 and 0.6%. Others have questioned this assumption, arguing that it is difficult to separate out the more general population shift away from tobacco from the increasing prices. Cato Institute analysis in 2014 estimated an actual elasticity of negative 0.065% that would suggest that factors exogenous to the cost are overwhelmingly driving reduced demand for cigarettes. But whether or not higher prices, of course, including higher taxes, meaningfully reduce consumption overall, they can certainly very easily shift the point of sale. Each year, the Tax Foundation partners with Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan, it's a think tank in Michigan, to conduct a statistical analysis of available data to estimate cigarette smuggling rates for each state. We look at the purchase patterns, we look at, we look at all of the available data, a lot of it federal data, and try to determine where are cigarettes being sold, where are they being smuggled. Smuggled cigarettes, of course, make up a substantial portion of cigarette consumption in many states. Criminals take advantage of tax arbitrage opportunities and other cost arbitrage opportunities afforded by differing tax rates in the several states. The median state tax rate is about $1.53 a pack. The highest rate is New York's $4.35 a pack, and that doesn't even count a New York City additional rate of $1.50. Unsurprisingly, New York leads the nation in smuggled cigarette sales, but incredibly, that number is actually 57% of all cigarettes sold in New York are smuggled. That means we're not just talking, I think people think smuggled cigarettes, they're thinking street sales or things like this. These are not the so-called loosies. This is if you go into a C-store, there is a very good chance that they are actually smuggled cigarettes, and if you were to check the tax stamp, it might say West Virginia or something other than New York. Now, of course, West Virginia doesn't have that problem. In fact, West Virginia sees a substantial outflow. Over 20% of cigarettes purchased in West Virginia are resold elsewhere, according to our estimates. Neighboring Virginia, with its 30 cents per pack tax, is even a more popular source of the black market trade. Of course, organized smuggling isn't the only tax arbitrage that takes place when tobacco taxes diverge across state lines, and some of that is not organized. Cigarette taxes are 25 cents a pack lower across the border in Virginia, and 5 cents higher currently in Kentucky. So there's already an incentive for a regular smoker in West Virginia who may not be far from the Virginia line to stock up in Virginia when they get that chance. At 25 cents a pack, $2.50 a carton, it's not huge. I doubt anyone's going to go way out of their way to do that, but if you're near the border or you're in Virginia and you're a regular smoker, there's an opportunity, of course, to save a bit of money by doing that, and certainly we know that people engage in such activities. Should West Virginia raise cigarette taxes substantially, Kentucky may become a viable option for such transactions as well, and certainly Virginia could look significantly more viable. Again, right now there's a quarter a pack, $2.50 a carton difference, but if you're looking at a tax of, say, $1.25, suddenly you're looking at like $10 a carton, and it becomes much more viable. So in short, whether or not tobacco users would maintain current consumption patterns in the face of tobacco tax increase, there very well may prove to be responses to higher taxes in terms of where the individual consumer or their suppliers procure those tobacco products, meaning, of course, less tax revenue for Virginia compared to the expectations because purchasing declines, even if consumption does not. Even as fewer Americans smoke or consume tobacco or smokeless tobacco products, more Americans are turning to electronic cigarettes. 8.5% of American adults have used an e-cigarette at least once. Over a third of current cigarette smokers have done so. Studies indicate that nationwide, about 2/3 of electronic cigarette users are current smokers. Many of the remaining third are former smokers who may have transitioned or may have previously given up traditional tobacco products and now have moved to vapor products. It suggests, as one would expect, that the e-cigarette market share poaches substantially from the traditional tobacco market, which will probably continue to accelerate the decline in cigarette and other traditional tobacco product use. Electronic cigarettes generally do not fall under taxes that capture tobacco products other than cigarettes because, outside of Minnesota, the use of nicotine itself has not been deemed sufficient to term e-cigarettes a tobacco product. West Virginia, of course, has another tobacco products tax. It is an ad valorem tax of 7% on those tobacco products. That covers your smokeless tobacco. It does not cover e-cigarettes currently because while there's a nicotine component, it's not considered a tobacco product. Given recent trends, many other states are looking to impose new taxes on vapor products. In 2015 alone, legislation to tax vapor was introduced in 23 states. Beyond Minnesota, where this was done administratively in a way that I doubt will be replicated in other states, 3 other states in the District of Columbia have adopted taxes legislatively. The 3 states are Kansas, Louisiana, and North Carolina that impose an excise tax on milliliters of e-cigarette fluid. The District of Columbia imposes an ad valorem tax on the wholesale price, as does Minnesota under its administrative ruling. And there's been a lot of debate about the rationale for vapor taxes. And sometimes it's just a straightforward revenue argument that if consumption's moving away from traditional cigarettes and smokeless tobacco products, we're losing revenue. We have to offset that by shifting it towards where the consumption is. and the tax structure thus changes. But tobacco excise taxes have long been defended on public health grounds as well, promoting cigarette cessation or providing funding for tobacco-related health expenditures, either or both. So if e-cigarettes are thought of as comparatively less health-adverse substitutes for traditional tobacco products, or potentially even for some people a smoking cessation tool, then extending these sin taxes, so-called, to these products might prove counterproductive. It's also discriminating against products in a somewhat unique way, as I'll reference a little later, especially with the ad valorem component. It can also prove extraordinarily complicated. Whether the goal is to tax vapor on an equalized basis with cigarettes or at a reduced rate, the conversion factors involved make it hard to know what the target rate should be. There's no simple way to compare milliliters of e-juice, or e-liquid, as people call it, to cigarettes. Some would say that a milliliter roughly corresponds to a pack of cigarettes. Others insist it's more like 2 milliliters. Of course, one can compare the nicotine content, but for users, a more accurate comparison is arguably how many cigarettes it replaces, which can vary widely from user to user based on voltage, usage pattern, nicotine concentration, and more. And of course, nicotine concentration differs in cigarettes as well, and the excise tax on cigarettes does not distinguish between high nicotine and low nicotine cigarettes. A mid-range e-juice dosage, and I did have to look this up, I really did not know any of the dosages before I prepared for this, but a mid-range dosage would be about 12 milligrams of nicotine per milliliter. I understand that a pack-a-day smoker would be more likely to choose something in the 18 milligram range. Traditional cigarette contains between 8 and 20 milligrams, that's per cigarette, not per pack, but only about 1 milligram of that is typically absorbed. More of the nicotine in e-cigarettes is inhaled, typically about half the concentration. So at a high concentration, a little over a milligram of e-cigarette liquid would provide about the same nicotine absorption as a pack of cigarettes, could be up to 2 milligrams for low concentration. So if we're looking at total nicotine in the product rather than absorption, a single cigarette contains as much as a milligram of liquid, but bearing in mind that 1 or 2 milligrams could suffice for a pack of 20 cigarettes. So the question, of course, is how do you equalize or normalize these taxes? The difficulty becomes clear pretty quickly. Notably, again, cigarette excise taxes don't distinguish between types of cigarettes, and excises on vapor haven't done so either. But clearly, an effort at equalizing the tax across tobacco products and vapor products would prove highly subjective. Essentially, states opting to impose an excise tax on vapor have to make that determined somewhat independently of the rate on cigarettes, though in these considerations it's important to ask two questions. One, whether the theories behind the taxation of cigarettes suggest that the tax on e-cigarettes should be lighter than on traditional tobacco products, and two, whether the traditional justifications of a specific excise tax on a product even hold up for e-cigarettes. Because generally, excise taxes conform in some way to the benefits test or to matters of negative externalities. This is why they tend not to be ad valorem taxes, because the costs of society are not pegged to price. Most gas taxes, for instance, are excise taxes because the costs imposed by driving, both in terms of wear and tear to infrastructure and to creating congestion on the roads and highways, are largely independent of the cost of a gallon of gasoline. The same holds true for tobacco products. If we conclude that smoking a cigarette imposes societal costs or is otherwise something that government may wish to discourage, which some governments, of course, have sought to do through cigarette taxes, then the sales price really doesn't matter. The societal costs are the same whether a pack of cigarettes sells for $2 or $5. The logic has been fairly consistently applied across the states in imposing excise taxes on cigarettes, but the consistency vanishes with taxes on other tobacco products. Smokeless tobacco is often subject to ad valorem taxes rather than a per unit tax. And that's what West Virginia does, imposing a tax of 7% on the wholesale price of these products. And in neighboring states, Virginia, Maryland, and Ohio do the same thing at rates of 10, 15, and 17% respectively. Kentucky, by contrast, imposes a 9.5 cent per unit excise, and Pennsylvania does not impose a special tax on smokeless tobacco products at all. If the rationale for unique taxes on tobacco and related products is to discourage consumption by making it more expensive, or to pay for the public health cost tobacco use imposes, then excise taxes for cigarettes as well as smokeless tobacco products would seem like the obvious choice, because the societal costs are not correlated with sales prices. If these policy rationales are not the basis of the state's tobacco taxes, then it's important to ask what exactly the goal is of these taxes. If they're merely seen as another revenue source without any regard to any unique tobacco-related policy considerations, then it's worth noting some of the other aspects of tobacco taxes, including the fact that they're fairly regressive given the population that uses tobacco. Presumably these taxes were intended, at least in part, to internalize the societal costs of tobacco use. In which case, again, ideally the tax on smokeless tobacco would also be an excise tax rather than the ad valorem tax that West Virginia currently imposes. Minnesota and Washington, D.C. impose an ad valorem tax on e-cigarettes. Similar legislation has been introduced in other states. With vapor products, ad valorem taxes are particularly problematic because the product varies so greatly. Some vapor products are single-use, while others are rechargeable and refillable. An ad valorem tax, if poorly structured, can hit the disposable e-cigarette harder than a specific tax, since the disposables typically contain less fluid, and also because the tax is potentially assessed on both the fluid and the delivery mechanisms. Now, I've seen the materials that was put together for West Virginia, and the intent was simply to tax the fluid. The challenge then becomes how you administer that, because there are separate purchases. You can buy fluid for a refillable, but there are also disposable e-cigarette products where it looks like a cigarette, it's the cig-alike types, and it has fluid in it. Is the tax just imposed on the value of the fluid inside, which of course is not billed separately, or is it taxed on the entire product, which will include the plastic and the coil and everything else? It would be very difficult if we're imposing this essentially as a sales tax to know how much the cost of the material is and how much the cost of the e-cigarette is. Now you could make, of the vapor product is. Now you could make that distinction certainly if we're talking about buying the device separately, where presumably if you're just applying it to the liquid, the tax would not fall on purchasing a device that does not contain liquid. But again, many of these products are a combination, and that poses a serious problem for any tax that is designed either as liquid only, because how do you administer it, or a tax that is just a straight ad valorem tax on the vapor product, including all parts, because now you are imposing a tax that is designed to be a rate for liquid, now applying to other products as well that may have very different price ranges. So that poses a problem, and that's why the states that have moved forward with these cigarette taxes have largely been looking at excise taxes. That would be a break with what has been done with smokeless tobacco products, where most of them are ad valorem. Of course, with smokeless tobacco, you're not looking at equipment, though you do have the issue, the question of whether moist or any of these products really, whether there's a real distinction, whether it is an inexpensive can or an expensive can, whether the brand should make a difference as to what the tax rate is. I think, again, there's a very strong case to be made that any tobacco product taxes should be excise taxes at some set rate and not an ad valorem tax. There's a strong case to be made against the idea of imposing new specific taxes on vapor products at all, since, again, from a public health standpoint, these products, often utilized as a substitute for traditional cigarettes, are widely held to produce less adverse health outcomes and therefore impose lower societal costs than cigarettes. Whatever the policy the state adopts, however, it's important to ensure that the theory and the incidence of tax align. And again, I was sent a copy of the impact of excise tax rate changes. I know that there's been an effort to look at what would you gain at 75 cents a pack, at $1, at $1.50. So the proposal that I've seen, like if it was $1.50, the estimate is $121.7 million increased revenue in the first year. Now, of course, at 55 cents, you're bringing in about 100. So there's the recognition that going from 55 to 75%, maybe you're going to have a 10% drop off in use. There's a recognition that the drop off is going to be more substantial if you are looking at $1.50 a pack. Some of that will be declines in actual consumption. Some of that will be smuggling or just purchasing across state lines. So there is a recognition of that in the estimates that you have been provided. Again, I think that experience may suggest that it could even be more of a drop-off than that, but these are reasonable numbers, and I don't wish to quibble with them. I would only say that, again, you should think of these essentially as being the high water mark. Most taxes, if you chose to raise them, you would be looking at increases year over year as the economy grows. With cigarette and other tobacco-related taxes, you should generally think that each year you are going to see some decline in the revenue for those. So that is certainly a concern as you move forward. And again, there were also, look at changing the ad valorem rates from 7% to 10.5%, and maybe adding e-cigarette fluid at 7%. Again, I would suggest that looking at excise taxes, if anything at all, would be a better option. And I'd be happy to take any questions you have.